The dust-stained letter trembled in Lillian Verity's hands as she stood at the desolate train station in Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, 1878. 3 days without food had left her light-headed. The promise of marriage that had brought her 2,000 miles west, now revealed as nothing but cruel deception. She had traveled to wed a man she'd never met, only to discover upon arrival that he'd died 2 months prior, leaving her stranded without money, connections, or hope in a frontier town that looked at her with suspicious eyes. Lillian clutched her threadbare traveling coat closer as the late autumn wind swirled around her. At 22, she had exhausted every opportunity back in Boston after her parents' deaths left her penniless. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed her salvation. Now it felt like her death sentence. Her stomach growled painfully as she sank onto her trunk, watching the station master lock up for the night. The last stagecoach had departed, and she had nowhere to go. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't fill her stomach or provide shelter. "Miss, station's closing," the elderly station master called, his voice not unkind but firm. "I have nowhere to go," Lillian admitted, her voice barely audible. The man sighed, visibly uncomfortable. "Town's got a boarding house, but—" He trailed off, both of them knowing she couldn't afford it. As darkness fell and the station master reluctantly departed, Lillian remained, shivering beside her single trunk of possessions. The streets of Copper Ridge grew quiet, punctuated only by occasional bursts of laughter from the saloon down the street. She hadn't realized she was quietly crying until a deep voice startled her. "Madam, you all right?" Lillian looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the fading light. As he stepped closer, she could make out a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were dust-covered but well-maintained, the mark of a working man who took pride in himself despite the harsh elements. "I'm fine," she lied, hastily wiping her tears. The stranger studied her with piercing blue eyes. "Forgive my bluntness, madam, but you don't look fine," he gestured to her trunk. "Just arrived?" "Yes." She saw no reason to elaborate. The man removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that caught the last rays of sunlight. "Wade Yates, madam." "I run cattle about 10 miles outside town. Lillian Verity," she replied automatically. "You waiting on someone, Miss Verity?" The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. "No," she whispered. "There's nobody." Wade frowned, noticing how she swayed slightly as she stood. "When's the last time you ate, Miss Verity?" Her pride wanted to lie, but her body betrayed her as her stomach growled audibly. "Day before yesterday," she admitted. "Just some hardtack on the train." Something shifted in Wade's expression. Without another word, he picked up her trunk with one hand and offered her his other arm. "The cafe's still open. Let's get you some food." Lillian hesitated. Taking charity from a stranger especially, a man went against everything she'd been taught, but hunger won out over propriety. Inside Millie's cafe, Wade ordered generously: steak, potatoes, beans, bread, and coffee. He sat across from her, sipping his own coffee as she tried and failed to eat slowly. "So you're a mail-order bride," he stated after she'd explained her situation between bites. Lillian nodded, shame coloring her cheeks. "James Blackburn was his name. I received confirmation to come, only to discover he'd been thrown from his horse 2 months ago. The letter must have crossed with mine." She stared into her coffee. "I have no money to return east." Wade considered this information carefully. "Blackburn's place was next to mine, decent ranch though smaller. Bank took it when there was no heir." "I didn't know him," Lillian confessed. "We exchanged 3 letters. It was an arrangement of necessity." "Most are out here," Wade replied without judgment. When Lillian had eaten her fill, Wade settled the bill and turned to her. "Miss Verity, I can offer you a proposition." Her body tensed instantly, eyes narrowing. Wade noticed and quickly clarified. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, is leaving to care for her daughter's new baby. I need someone to cook and keep house. The position includes room and board, plus wages that could get you back east eventually, if that's what you want." Relief flooded through her. "You're offering me employment?" "Yes, madam. Nothing more. You'd have your own room in the house, meals included. Mrs. Abernathy can show you the ropes before she leaves next week." Lillian studied him carefully. Wade Yates appeared to be in his early 30s, his face weathered by sun and wind but handsome in a rugged way. His eyes held no deception she could detect. "Why would you help me?" she asked suspiciously. Wade's smile was slight but genuine. "Because I need a housekeeper and you need a position. Simple as that." It wasn't simple, and they both knew it. A single woman living in a bachelor's home would raise eyebrows, but starvation offered no alternatives. "I accept," Lillian said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Yates." The Yates Ranch surprised Lillian. Unlike many frontier homes, the main house was solidly built with actual glass windows and a proper shingled roof. 4 rooms downstairs, 3 upstairs, and furnishings that, while not luxurious, spoke of care and permanence. Mrs. Abernathy, a plump woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and kind eyes, welcomed Lillian warmly. "Mr. Yates runs a respectable house," she assured Lillian as they prepared supper that first evening. "Been his housekeeper 5 years now. He's a good man, works hard." "Lost his wife before he came west." "He was married?" Lillian asked, surprised. "Widowed young, don't speak of it much." Mrs. Abernathy lowered her voice. "But he keeps her picture in his study." Over the next week, Lillian learned the rhythms of the ranch. Wade left before dawn each day, working with his small crew of cowhands. Meals were served promptly, laundry done on Mondays, baking on Tuesdays. Mrs. Abernathy taught her to manage the household accounts and showed her how Wade liked things ordered. "He's particular about some things," the older woman explained, "but fair, never raises his voice even when something displeases him." Lillian observed Wade carefully during meals. He spoke little but always politely, asking after her comfort, ensuring she had everything needed. He maintained a respectful distance, never entering her room or making her uncomfortable with his gaze. When Mrs. Abernathy departed the following week, Lillian found herself alone with Wade and the 3 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse. That evening, Wade knocked on the kitchen door as she finished washing dishes. "Miss Verity, I wanted to assure you that your reputation will be protected here," he said formally. "I've instructed the men that they're to treat you with absolute respect. And I hope you'll feel safe knowing my room is across the hall from yours should you need anything." The statement was both reassuring and disconcerting. "Thank you, Mr. Yates. I appreciate your consideration." The winter months passed in steady routine. Lillian found herself enjoying the work more than she'd expected. The kitchen became her domain, and she took pride in preparing meals that brought appreciation to Wade's usually reserved expression. Sometimes in the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Wade reading the newspaper while Lillian mended or worked on her embroidery. They rarely spoke beyond the necessary, but the silence was comfortable. Occasionally, Wade would read aloud something interesting from the newspaper, and they would discuss it briefly. Lillian discovered he was well-read and thoughtful, with opinions that surprised her. One evening in January, a blizzard howled outside the windows. The hands were confined to the bunkhouse, and Wade had spent the day in the barn tending to the animals. When he came in for supper, his hands were raw from the cold. Without thinking, Lillian took them between her own, rubbing them gently. "You'll get frostbite," she scolded softly. Wade looked startled at the contact, and Lillian immediately released his hands, embarrassed by her forwardness. "I apologize," she said quickly. "No need," Wade replied, his voice rougher than usual. "Thank you for your concern." That night marked a subtle shift in their relationship. Wade began sharing more about the ranch operations, asking her opinion on household improvements. Lillian found herself looking forward to their evening conversations. As winter thawed into spring, Lillian realized she was no longer counting the days until she could return east. The thought of leaving the ranch, of leaving Wade, created an uncomfortable tightness in her chest. April brought cattle buyers to the ranch. Lillian prepared elaborate meals, determined to impress these important business connections. On the final evening, she overheard one of the buyers speaking to Wade on the porch. "Fine woman you've got there, Yates. When's the wedding?" "Miss Verity is my housekeeper," Wade replied firmly. "Nothing more." "Shame to waste a good woman like that on just cooking and cleaning," the man laughed. "If you're not interested, plenty who would be." Lillian slipped away, her cheeks burning. Wade's words were proper and correct, she was only his housekeeper. Yet hearing him state it so plainly hurt in ways she hadn't expected. The following Sunday, Lillian attended church in town, as was her custom. Afterward, several ladies from the church auxiliary approached her. "Miss Verity," Mrs. Peterson began, her smile not reaching her eyes, "we've been concerned about your situation." "My situation?" Lillian asked, confused. "Living alone with Mr. Yates," another woman clarified. "It's not proper, dear, no matter how you frame it." "Mr. Yates is my employer," Lillian stated firmly. "There's nothing improper about our arrangement." Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows rose. "Perhaps not in practice, but in appearance. People talk, dear. Mr. Roberts at the Mercantile is a widower. He mentioned he's looking for a wife, someone to help with his children. We could arrange an introduction." Lillian felt her face flush. "Thank you for your concern, but I'm satisfied with my current position." The women exchanged knowing glances that made Lillian's stomach twist. When she returned to the ranch, Wade was in the barn. Impulsively, she sought him out, finding him brushing down his favorite horse. "The ladies of Copper Ridge think I should marry Mr. Roberts the shopkeeper," she announced without preamble. Wade's hand stilled on the horse's flank. "Is that what you want?" "No," Lillian replied honestly, "but they seem to think my reputation is compromised by working here." Wade turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I've tried to ensure your reputation remains intact." "I know," Lillian assured him. "You've been nothing but respectful, but apparently that doesn't matter." "It matters to me," Wade said quietly. They stood looking at each other for a long moment before Wade turned back to the horse. "If you wish to leave, I'll understand." "I don't wish to leave," Lillian said firmly, then retreated to the house before she could say more. That night Lillian barely slept, torn between propriety and the life she'd built at the ranch. By morning, she'd made a decision. After breakfast, she approached Wade in his study. "I'd like to continue working here," she stated. "I don't care what the town thinks." Wade studied her for a moment. "I care what they think about you, Miss Verity. Your reputation matters." "Then what do you suggest?" she asked, frustration edging her voice. Wade hesitated. "I could speak to Reverend Collins about finding you a position with a family in town." The suggestion felt like a physical blow. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," Wade answered quickly, "but I want to do what's right by you." "Then let me decide what's right for me," Lillian countered. Spring progressed into summer and the issue remained unresolved. Lillian noticed Wade spending more time away from the house, and their evening conversations grew less frequent. She told herself it was the busy season, nothing more. In June, a wagon accident left Wade with a badly sprained ankle. Confined to the house, his frustration was palpable as Lillian helped him to the sofa. "The men can manage without you for a few days," she insisted, propping his ankle on a cushion. "They shouldn't have to," he grumbled. Over the next 3 days, their forced proximity broke down the distance that had grown between them. Wade told her stories of his childhood in Missouri, his brief marriage to his childhood sweetheart who died of fever before they could start a family, his journey west to begin again. Lillian shared her own past her father's small bookshop in Boston, the illness that took both parents within months of each other, the distant relatives who had no room for a penniless young woman. "I'd run out of options," she admitted. Becoming a mail-order bride seemed better than the alternatives. "And now," Wade asked softly, "do you regret coming west?" Lillian met his eyes steadily. "No, despite everything, I don't regret it." As Wade recovered, Lillian noticed him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. His gaze followed her across rooms, lingered when she laughed. Something was building between them, something neither acknowledged. In July, Lillian celebrated her 23rd birthday. Wade surprised her with a gift, a beautiful leather-bound journal. "I noticed you writing sometimes on scraps of paper," he explained awkwardly. "Thought you might like something proper to keep your thoughts in." Touched by his observation, Lillian impulsively kissed his cheek. "Thank you, it's perfect." The brief contact left them both flustered, and Wade made an excuse to check on something in the barn. That night, Lillian wrote in her new journal, confronting feelings she'd been avoiding for months. She was in love with Wade Yates. The realization wasn't shocking, perhaps she'd known for some time, but acknowledging it brought both clarity and despair. She was his housekeeper. He was her employer. The boundaries between them were clear and necessary. August brought a severe drought. The creek that fed the ranch's water supply dwindled to a trickle. Wade and the men worked tirelessly to dig a new well closer to the house. Lillian watched from the kitchen window as Wade labored in the blistering sun, shirt clinging to his back with sweat. When the men finally struck water, their jubilant shouts brought Lillian running. Without thinking, she threw her arms around Wade in celebration. For a moment he held her tightly, his face buried in her hair. Then, suddenly aware of the men watching, they separated quickly. "Sorry," Lillian murmured, embarrassed. "Don't be," Wade replied quietly before turning back to the well. That evening, Wade rode into town for supplies. He returned after Lillian had gone to bed, but she heard him moving about downstairs long after midnight. In the morning, she found him at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, his expression troubled. "Is everything all right?" she asked, concerned by the dark circles under his eyes. "Ran into Mrs. Peterson in town," he said without preamble. "She made it quite clear what people are saying about us." Lillian stiffened. "I don't care what they say, you should." Wade's voice was firm. "A woman's reputation is everything out here." "So what do you propose?" Lillian asked, frustration rising. "That I marry Mr. Roberts, that I leave." Wade stood abruptly. "I don't know, but this can't continue as it is." For the next week, tension filled the house. Wade spent long hours away, and when present he was distracted and short-tempered. Lillian considered her options. She had saved some money, perhaps enough to get to Sacramento or Denver, where she might find work. The thought of leaving made her physically ill, but the current situation was becoming unbearable. One evening, Lillian was preparing supper when she heard Wade return earlier than usual. He appeared in the doorway, watching her silently. "We need to talk," he said finally. "Yes, we do," she agreed, wiping her hands on her apron. "I've been thinking about my position here. I want you to marry me," Wade interrupted. Lillian froze, certain she'd misheard. "What?" Wade stepped closer, his expression intense. "Marry me, Lillian," she stared at him, searching his face. "Because of what people are saying, because it's proper?" "No," Wade's voice softened. "Because I love you, because I can't imagine this house, my life, without you in it." "How long?" she whispered. "Since that first night at the station," he admitted. "But I didn't want you to feel obligated or trapped. I wanted to give you time, freedom to choose." Tears filled Lillian's eyes. "I thought I was just your housekeeper." Wade took her hands in his. "You've never been just anything to me, Lillian. You brought life back to this house to me. I've loved you for months but was too afraid to risk losing you completely." Lillian laughed through her tears. "And I've been loving you just as long, thinking it was hopeless." Wade drew her closer. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Lillian whispered, just before his lips met hers. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Copper Ridge. The same ladies who had gossiped about them now brought wedding gifts and offered congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity. "Told you they'd end up married," Mrs. Peterson whispered loudly to her companion. "These arrangements always do." Lillian just smiled, knowing the truth that only she and Wade shared, that theirs was a marriage born of love, not convenience or propriety. Their wedding night was tender and passionate as they discovered each other in new ways. Afterward, lying in Wade's arms, Lillian felt a contentment she'd never imagined possible when she'd stepped off that train nearly a year before. "I was so alone that day," she murmured against his chest. Starving and desperate, I remember thinking nobody in the world would ever love me again. Wade tightened his arms around her. I loved you even then, though I didn't know to call it that yet. As autumn returned to Copper Ridge, the Yates ranch flourished. Wade expanded the cattle operation, while Lillian transformed the house into a true home. They hosted a harvest dinner for neighboring ranchers, proudly standing together as husband and wife. During the festivities, Lillian overheard one of the guests ask Wade about their courtship. "How'd you convince such a fine woman to marry a rough cowboy like you?" the man asked jovially. Wade's eyes found Lillian across the room, his expression soft with love. "She said nobody loved her," he replied simply. "And I told her I did." The following spring brought new beginnings. The fruit trees Lillian had planted blossomed. Cattle calves dotted the pastures, and Lillian discovered she was expecting their first child. When she shared the news with Wade, he lifted her off her feet in joy, spinning her around the kitchen before setting her down gently, suddenly concerned. "Is that all right? Should I not have done that?" he fretted, making Lillian laugh. "The baby and I are fine," she assured him. "We're stronger than we look." Wade placed his hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "I know exactly how strong you are, Lillian Yates. You're the strongest person I've ever known." As her pregnancy progressed, Wade became endearingly protective, hiring extra help so Lillian could rest more. She humored him but continued managing the household, simply adjusting as needed. In November, almost exactly 2 years after she'd arrived in Copper Ridge, Lillian gave birth to a healthy daughter they named Elizabeth Rose. Wade, who had paced anxiously outside during the delivery, wept openly when the midwife placed the tiny bundle in his arms. "She's perfect," he whispered, sitting beside Lillian on the bed. "Just like her mother." Motherhood suited Lillian, and watching Wade with their daughter revealed new depths to his gentle nature. He sang Elizabeth to sleep each night, told her stories about the ranch animals, and proudly showed her off to everyone who visited. As Elizabeth grew, so did the ranch. Wade added a new wing to the house, built with the help of neighbors during a traditional barn-raising-style event. Lillian planted a proper vegetable garden and started selling preserves and baked goods in town, building a small business of her own. 3 years after Elizabeth's birth, their son William James joined the family, completing their happiness. The house rang with children's laughter, and Wade often said it was music sweeter than any he'd ever heard. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Wade surprised Lillian with a special gift: the deed to the neighboring property, once owned by James Blackburn, the man she'd originally come to marry. "I've been saving to buy it," Wade explained. "Thought we could expand, maybe plant an orchard on that south slope." Lillian traced the property lines on the deed. "It's perfect, Wade, but it's also strange to think about if things had gone as planned." "Then I wouldn't have found you at that station," Wade finished, pulling her close. "And my life would be empty." "Not empty," Lillian corrected, smiling up at him, "just waiting, like I was." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch swing, watching the stars appear over their land. Wade's arm was warm around her shoulders, and Lillian marveled at how completely her life had transformed. "Do you ever regret it?" Wade asked suddenly. "Coming west to marry a stranger, only to end up with a different man entirely?" Lillian considered the question seriously. "I regret the hunger and fear of those first days," she answered honestly. "But not the journey itself. It led me to you." Wade kissed her temple. "When I found you at that station, you looked like you'd lost everything." "I had," Lillian said softly, "but then I found something better than anything I'd lost." The ranch continued to prosper through the years. Elizabeth and William grew strong and capable, learning the ways of the land from their father and the arts of home and business from their mother. Copper Ridge expanded as the railroad brought more settlers, and the Yates family became respected pillars of the community. On quiet evenings, Wade and Lillian still sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. Sometimes they spoke of the future, the children's education, ranch improvements, dreams for their growing community. Other times they simply enjoyed the silence and each other's presence. One such evening, as they watched the spectacular colors fade from the Arizona sky, Wade squeezed Lillian's hand. "You know what I think about sometimes?" he asked. "What's that?" "How close I came to not going to town that night," he admitted. "I almost stayed home, had plenty of work to do. But something told me to ride in. Call it fate or providence or just plain luck, but something led me to that train station at exactly the right moment." Lillian rested her head on his shoulder. "I used to think it was the worst day of my life. Alone, starving, betrayed by circumstance. I remember saying aloud that nobody in the world loved me. And I said I did," Wade finished, "though I didn't know yet how true those words would become." As darkness settled over the ranch, the Yates home glowed with warmth and light, a beacon in the vast wilderness that had once seemed so hostile to a starving bride who'd traveled west on nothing but hope and desperation. Inside, the family Lillian and Wade had built together thrived, their love story continuing to unfold with each passing season. The desperate young woman at the train station and the lonely rancher who found her there had both been searching without knowing it for home, for family, for love. Against all odds, they had found it in each other, proving that even in the harshest landscapes, the human heart could not only survive but flourish.